Greetings and being the new viewer. Tonight on Midnight Broadcast I present you with eerie tales found across various forms of media that were compiled on X. Now without further ado, the first story comes from Robin Bay, North Yorkshire, 1999. It's told by one Norman Green. In his own words.
Shortly after Easter one year, my wife and I went to Blackpool for a long weekend. After dinner on Friday, my wife retired to our rented apartment and I went to the old bridge inn at the top of the road and ordered a pint of Boddington's. I saw a man at the end of the bar watching me. Eventually he walked over. "Excuse me for staring," he said.
"Excuse me for staring, but do you come from South Yorkshire?"
"I was born there," I replied, "but we moved to North Yorkshire 20 years ago."
"Your name isn't Norman by any chance?"
he asked. I was stunned. "Yes, it is actually."
"Well, I'm Jimmy Marriott,"
he replied. Suddenly the penny dropped. When we were kids, Jimmy lived next door, but two to us in Thorpe. Jimmy, being the oldest by 3 years, was the leader of our gang. I ordered 2 more pints and we talked about the old days. He asked about my sister, who he used to fancy. Eventually the landlord rang the bell and we arranged to meet the following evening as he wanted me to introduce him to my wife. With that we said good night. I told my wife the strange story next morning and we decided to go to the pub at about 8:30 that evening. There was no sign of Jimmy. I asked the landlord if he had seen the bloke I had been talking to the previous night. "Sorry," he replied, "I saw you come in, but I didn't see you talking to anyone." We waited until 9:30 p.m., drank up and went for a walk around town thinking no more of it. When we were back home on Monday, my sister rang, which she has done like clockwork for years with the news and gossip, as we don't get down to see her very much. She asked how the weekend went and I told her about meeting her old friend Jimmy Marriott. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Are you trying to be funny? Because if you are, it's in very bad taste." Very quietly she told me that Jimmy Marriott had been killed in a car accident on his way home from work just outside Barnsley at 6:30 on Friday night.
The next one is a lovely little story told by a man named Peter Lowe.
During the long and pleasant summer of 1960, when I was 7 years old, I passed the house of an old lady each morning on my way to school. She was usually in a rickety old chair on her front porch. "Good morning, Mrs. Thorpe," I would call out. She would reply,
"Good morning, Peter."
One night near the end of the school year, I dreamed I was walking to school past Mrs. Thorpe's house. She was there as usual, sitting on her porch, and I noticed with detachment that she had no face. Despite this, I called out as usual, "Good morning, Mrs. Thorpe." And in return, I heard a voice that was calm and kindly, but devastating nonetheless.
"Goodbye, Peter."
I sat upright in bed, breathless and sweating. After a moment I lay down again and was soon asleep. The next morning, as I packed my satchel for school, my mother told me in a hushed voice that Mrs. Thorpe had been taken ill during the night and had died. Even though I was a young boy, I knew I had been privileged. Mrs. Thorpe had come to me in death and bid me farewell. I never told anyone of my experience that night until I was a grown man.
The next one is a short tale about a haunted mirror.
My friend Anna was working as an English teacher in Budapest between 1992 and 1994. She had a flat in an oldish, perhaps 1930s, apartment block. The furniture, apparently, looked like it had been there since the place was built, all very solid wooden stuff. In her dining room, there was a large antique mirror, and it was this that was the spooky thing. Anna swears blind that at certain times of the day, usually between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, anyone looking in it would see not just themselves, but a group of 6 or 7 soldiers in the room with them. The soldiers were wearing, according to her, World War I type uniforms and had old rifles. The mirror always showed the same thing: the men were relaxing around a table, eating and chatting, while one of them looked anxiously out of the window. And that was it. Sadly, the mirror got broken by a visitor to the flat who got freaked out by what he saw. Bugger.
In this one, the friends spot a man. Only not a man.
Some years ago, after a night of general chat, A friend and I were walking from another friend's house to my own in the leafy suburb of Brockley in southeast London. I had drunk only tea or soft drinks all night and had consumed no drugs whatsoever. It was around 6 a.m. and dawn was breaking when we saw a figure walking up the street towards us. The word we coined later to describe its movement was lolloping, a kind of up and down bouncy walk. It took a few seconds for the two of us to realize this was no human being. "See that man?" I asked. "Yes." "It's not a man, though, is it?" I found myself saying. "No," said my friend, sounding scared. "It isn't." The creature was entirely black and like a cardboard cutout, flat and one-dimensional. It had no features at all, and arms that hung down to its knees. It seemed to be ignoring us, then seemed to realize we could see it and began to lollop faster towards us. We ran to my front door and hid in the hallway as quiet and unmoving as possible when we saw the thing we felt it was male approach the front door. It appeared to look through the glass, from the way its head moved up and down and around. It then turned away. We didn't sleep for some time after that, discussing what we saw. It was shaped like many descriptions of greys, but both of us came away with the impression that what we saw was not of this world, but from a parallel dimension. We instinctively felt it was not a creature to try and communicate with, and not something that it was good to be near. We felt that if this creature had somehow got hold of us, we would not be around today to tell the tale.
Then shift from ghost stories to a few eerie events that I found particularly interesting. The first one comes from New York.
One day in the year 2000, I was alone in my New York apartment with my cat Polly when the telephone rang. An unfamiliar voice told me that my wife had just called to report that there was a fire in my oven. I told the doorman. I assumed at the time it was the doorman that I had no wife and there was no fire in my oven. Coincidentally, however, there had been a fire in my electric oven a week previously. Shortly after I hung up, there was a knock at my door. It was two white men in their 30s. They were in plain clothes and didn't offer any identification. They said they were from building security, even though I knew that all building security guards wear uniform. One of the men was very calm, as he told me that my wife had called in to report a fire in my oven. I explained once again that I had no wife and no fire in my oven. The other man seemed to be in a violent rage and told the calm man that he was going in no matter what. His rage was very frightening. Suddenly, Polly jumped up on a chair in plain view of the doorway. As soon as the calm one saw the cat, he grabbed the angry one by the shoulder and pulled him away. There was no question that seeing my cat had some sort of effect on the calm one. A few moments later, an authentic building security guard with uniform and badge appeared at my door, once again saying that my wife had called to report the fire in my oven. I denied both wife and fire. He shrugged his shoulders and left. Who were these two men, one so relaxed, the other so furious? What was it about seeing the cat that caused them to retreat so suddenly? Who was the woman pretending to be my wife?
This next one is a mix of ghost story and eerie event. I enjoyed this one very much. I hope you do, too.
In 1965, I had just bought my first car, and I took my wife and two daughters out into the country for a ride and picnic. Not far from here is a ruined castle and church, and in part of the church lies the body of a crusader. My daughters wanted to see his tomb, and I lifted them up so that they could look inside through a grill in the door. Suddenly my wife gave a shout and I turned around. There was a gentleman standing there behind us. None of us had heard him approaching, even though the path we were on, and the surrounding area, was covered in deep gravel. He looked visibly shaken, and was crying. I asked him what was the matter. He asked us to follow him through the churchyard, which we did. Then he asked us to go and read the inscription on a tombstone and return, and tell him what the inscription said. The inscription read, "Here lies the body of Harold James Bell of Silloth, Cumberland. Born June 21, 1815. Died June 21, 1865, aged 50 years." I read this aloud and the stranger broke down completely. After a short while, he gathered himself and said, "I'm Harold James Bell of Silloth, Cumberland. And I was born in June 21, 1915. Today is my 50th birthday. That day, by coincidence, was June 21, 1965. So indeed, if the man was telling the truth, it was his birthday. He went on to say that he was a sales rep for a Cumberland company, and had been tasked with traveling into the area work on that day. However, 5 miles from here something unexplainable happened. As he was driving, some unknown force took control of the car and forced it off the main roads through a narrow country lane to this place. Then the car stopped, and he had been pushed and shoved by something invisible through the churchyard until he came to the tombstone. We thought this a very strange story, and I wondered what it could mean. The stranger, however, was convinced that the event was a way of showing him that he had come to the end of his natural life, and that he would soon die. We could not convince him otherwise. My wife was really upset over the affair, and I decided we would leave. I escorted Mr. Bell back to his car and left. Next Monday, I told the story to my manager at work, and a week later he came to me with a laugh and complimented me on telling such a good story. He and his wife, walking in the area, decided to go and see the tombstone, and couldn't find it. I found this amazing because I didn't think it could be missed. So that evening after work I returned to the graveyard, and sure enough there was no gravestone, nor sign that it ever existed. My wife and I have revisited the site many times out of curiosity. I always wonder what became of the unhappy Mr. Bell. Did he even really exist? Our conversation, the atmosphere, and the unreality of it all, it made this the strangest happening in all my life.
In this next story, a Canadian gentleman continually spots an odd-like feather.
In the summer of 1980, I started seeing a strange little guy at the bus stop in Calgary on weekday mornings. His skin, eyes and hair all looked artificial. He had a gray suit and briefcase for that totally normal look, and always stared at the paper. He never made a sound, never looked up, his eyes never scanned the page or blinked, he never turned the page. He got on the bus with me and stayed on till after my stop. I kept thinking he looked just like something disguised as a human being. This went on exactly the same every day for a few days. Then one day he wasn't there, but he got on at the next stop round the corner, so I figured he was running late and would have missed the earlier stop, and probably lived close to both of them. Next day he was back at my stop again, got on with me, and then at the next stop round the corner, another guy got on who looked exactly, and I mean exactly, like him. They both stared at their papers, neither one acknowledging the other's presence in any way. No one else on the bus appeared to notice that there were two absolutely identical guys on board with them. It was as if I was the only one who could see, or the only one who wasn't in on it. That was my last day living in that neighborhood, so I never saw either of them again.
The next story comes from Shreveport, Louisiana. It involves one Katie Mason's encounter with the men in black.
In the early hours of the morning, Katie had seen a UFO in the sky while she was driving home from the diner she worked at. It was bowl-shaped, about 20 feet in diameter, and bright pink in color. Katie was amazed by the sight, and slowed down her car on the largely empty road. It was seen for barely 10 or 15 seconds, but that was enough for Katie to know what she saw, a UFO. She drove home, somewhat shaky and excited, went to bed, and that was it. At least, It was until the next morning. There was a knock on the door around 9:45 a.m. It jolted Katie from her sleep, as she hadn't got home until around 2:30 a.m. Katie opened the door to the sight of nothing less than a man in black. We're talking about the type of men in black that John Keel wrote about in, largely, the 1960s and the 1970s, the creepy-looking, scrawny, pale men in blacks that have zero to do with the government. They're way weirder than that. Like so many people who see the men in black, Katie opened the door and immediately let the men in black in, something that she would never do under normal circumstances. Here's where things get strange. Katie can only remember certain aspects of the grilling that the men in black gave her. She can remember inviting the man in black into her duplex. But she cannot remember how he left. She knows she was threatened by the black-garbed thing, but can't recall what the threat actually was. And when the men in black left, and Katie's mind started to come back to normal, she saw two of her coffee mugs on the living room table, but she had zero recall of making the coffee.
There's a different story similar to Katie's. This one involves a man named Paul found and a woman in black.
Paul is someone who I met in the UK back in the summer of 1997. At the time, Paul spent 10 days checking out the crop circles that had appeared during that summer in the county of Wiltshire, England, which is where most of the formations are made on a yearly basis. He too had a story that involved missing time, but, just like Katie, not at all of the type associated with alien abductions. Paul told me that he had been walking around one of the formations just as the sun was starting to rise when a woman appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. She was dressed in a long black cape that had a black hood. Paul said her skin was extremely pale and her face was very thin. She engaged him in what seemed to be a very short conversation, warning him not to dig too deep into the subject. The woman in black then turned and exited the huge and intricate formation. For reasons that he was unable to understand, Paul felt both nauseous and frightened. Here's the strangest part of the story. Paul found himself quite confused due to the fact that although it seemed to have been a brief encounter, when he checked he realized there was far more to it. According to his watch, close to 3/4 of an hour were missing from Paul's memory. And although the woman had something to say to Paul of a warning nature, he couldn't remember exactly what he said in response to her.
I hope you enjoy tonight's tales. Do you have any similar experiences? Have you encountered something that you could not explain? If you do, I encourage you to leave a comment below.
Thank you for subscribing to Midnight Broadcast. More Greentexts from XR Farming and new broadcasts will appear when the clock strikes midnight at Central Time.